Something inside the Cleveland Browns didn't fall apart publicly. There was no explosive press conference, no messy firing cycle, no dramatic leaks pointing fingers. Instead, something far more unsettling happened. A presence that once felt central to the organization simply vanished, quietly, completely. And the speed of it made people inside the league stop and ask questions no one in Cleveland has answered out loud. This wasn't a normal coaching shuffle, not the kind where someone gets passed over, reassigned, or asked to wait their turn. This was a clean erasure. One minute, a coach was being talked about as part of the future. The next, his name stopped coming up entirely. No follow-ups, no explanations, just silence. And in the NFL, silence like that is rarely accidental. Because here's the part that feels off. Teams hesitate all the time. They debate, they delay, they keep options open, especially with coaches who've already been trusted, already sat in key rooms, already held responsibility that most never reach. When someone at that level disappears overnight, it usually isn't about a bad call sheet or one disappointing season. It suggests something deeper broke, something the organization didn't want lingering around. What made this moment stand out wasn't just who was removed, but how final it felt. No safety net, no fallback role, no soft landing, just a door closing so fast it barely made noise. Around the league, that kind of decision is understood as a message, not to fans, not to media, but internally. A signal that whatever happened behind closed doors was serious enough that continuity became a liability. And that's why this story refuses to die. Because when organizations erase people instead of explaining them away, they're usually protecting something bigger than optics. They're correcting something they believe never should have happened in the first place. The question is, what exactly was Cleveland trying to undo without ever admitting it existed? At first glance, it looked ordinary. Another off-season decision, another name quietly sliding off the depth chart of the organization. But the more people looked at what actually happened, the harder it became to explain it away as routine. Because the coach at the center of this wasn't a fringe assistant or an expendable hire. This was Tommy Rees, someone the organization had already invested in, trusted, and elevated. Rees wasn't brought into the building to observe. He wasn't hidden on the sidelines learning the ropes. He was given real responsibility. He was allowed to call plays. He was included in high-level conversations. Most importantly, he was trusted enough to sit down directly with ownership during the head coaching interview process. In the NFL, that alone separates you from dozens of assistants who never get that opportunity. Teams don't do that unless they see you as part of the future. And then, almost immediately, that future disappeared. There was no second interview, no public explanation, no statement framing it as timing or fit. According to reports, Rees wasn't just passed over for the top job, he was removed from the entire equation, not retained as a coordinator, not shifted into another role, not kept around for continuity, just gone. In NFL terms, that isn't a pause, it's a rejection, and those usually don't happen without something going wrong behind the scenes. What made it even glaring was what was happening at the same time. Other candidates were getting second looks. Some were being brought back into the building. Some were being discussed openly as part of the next phase. Rees wasn't included in any of that. His name dropped out of circulation so fast it felt deliberate. When one candidate gets reconsidered and another gets erased, that contrast tells you this wasn't just about who was the best option. It was about who the organization didn't want tied to its future at all. That's the part that doesn't line up with the public narrative. If Cleveland simply believed Rees wasn't ready to lead, the logical move would have been to keep him in-house. Young offensive coaches with his resume don't vanish unless a bridge has been burned, especially not when they're still viewed around the league as ascending. Organizations protect assets unless they believe those assets have become risks. And that's why this disappearance hit differently. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was decisive. Cleveland didn't hedge, they didn't wait, they didn't explain. They made a clean cut, the kind teams make when they aren't just changing direction, but correcting something they believed went wrong. And once you recognize that, it becomes clear this wasn't just about Tommy Rees, the coach. It was about what he represented inside the building and why the Browns suddenly wanted none of it left behind. Once Tommy Rees disappeared from the picture, attention inside league circles shifted almost immediately to one connection that felt impossible to separate from the decision: his alignment with Kevin Stefanski. This is where a theory began circulating, not as confirmed fact, but as a way to make sense of how fast and final the cutoff was. Around the league, people started referring to it quietly as the Stefanski pipeline theory. To be clear, this is speculation, not an accusation, not a proven internal finding. But in the NFL, speculation often follows patterns, and this pattern stood out. Stefanski didn't just work alongside Rees. He selected him, he elevated him, he trusted him with play-calling responsibility, and brought him into the inner circle. That level of trust usually signals shared philosophy, shared vision, and alignment on how the team should operate. For a time, that alignment was considered a strength. According to reports and growing league chatter, that same alignment may have eventually worked against Rees. As Stefanski's grip on the locker room reportedly weakened, scrutiny didn't stop at the head coach. It spread outward to everyone seen as part of his decision-making branch. Ownership wasn't just evaluating schemes or play designs anymore. They were evaluating accountability. Who challenged decisions, who reinforced them, and who may have benefited from a structure that fans and players increasingly questioned. The theory suggests that Rees wasn't viewed as an independent voice during that evaluation. Instead, it's been said that he was perceived, fairly or unfairly, as an extension of the existing system, not someone representing a fresh start, but someone symbolizing continuity at a time when continuity had lost trust. Again, there's no confirmation that Rees blocked change, ignored concerns, or acted improperly. The issue wasn't misconduct, it was perception. And perception can be just as influential as reality when ownership decides to reset. In the NFL, optics matter internally more than they do publicly. When leadership believes a system failed, they often remove not just the architect, but the framework that supported it. That's why Rees didn't get the usual benefit of separation. There was no pause to reassess him on his own merits, no attempt to rebrand his role. The organization moved quickly, as if it had already decided he represented more of the past than the future. What makes this theory stick is how decisive Cleveland was. Coaches who aren't quite ready usually get parked. Coaches tied to broken structures usually get cut. And from the outside, this looked less like a talent decision and more like a distancing move. Whether the Stefanski connection fully explains Rees's exit or only partially influenced it, the outcome tells the same story. Cleveland didn't want reminders of how things used to operate. They wanted a break, clean, sharp, and unmistakable. And once that realization settles in, the focus naturally shifts to the part of that old structure fans questioned the most. Because coaching pipelines don't collapse in isolation. They collapse when belief breaks somewhere much closer to the field. No matter how many angles people explored, every version of this story kept circling back to the same unresolved point: the quarterback room. More specifically, Shedeur Sanders. That's where the speculation intensified, not because of one moment, but because of a season's worth of quiet contradictions that never fully sat right with fans or observers around the league. Publicly, the messaging was clean and consistent. The team framed the quarterback situation as an open competition. Reps would be earned, performance would decide everything. On paper, it sounded fair, it sounded standard. But according to reports, observations, and growing fan debate, what happened behind the scenes didn't perfectly match that narrative. That disconnect is where the controversy began. And it's important to say this clearly: these are allegations and interpretations, not confirmed facts. The biggest point of tension was opportunity. In the NFL, quarterback development doesn't happen evenly. It happens through reps, timing, and trust, especially reps with the first team. According to multiple accounts and visible practice patterns, Shedeur wasn't consistently receiving those reps. Meanwhile, the competition was still being discussed as if both quarterbacks were operating on equal footing. That gap between language and reality is what sparked the backlash. Fans weren't just questioning decisions, they were questioning whether the evaluation process itself was tilted. From that perspective, some began to argue Shedeur didn't lose a job, he never fully had access to it. That interpretation spread quickly, especially as the season unfolded and opportunities remained limited. Again, there's no proof that he was intentionally held back, no official admission, no internal documents stating bias or pre-decisions. But in the NFL, perception often forms when patterns repeat without explanation. What pushed those suspicions further was what happened when Shedeur finally did step onto the field. With limited preparation and little rhythm built through the week, he didn't unravel, he didn't look overwhelmed. He managed pressure, extended plays, and led late drives that kept games alive when things were already slipping away. For many viewers, that mattered more than raw numbers. It challenged the idea that he wasn't ready. It made people question what he might have looked like with genuine investment instead of emergency snaps. Supporters began asking an uncomfortable question. If this is what he looked like without consistent first-team reps, without a system designed around his strengths, and without clear organizational backing, what would he look like if all three of those aligned? That question didn't come from blind loyalty, it came from watching poise show up where panic usually does. Critics countered with valid points. Coaches see mistakes fans miss. Footwork, progressions, meeting room details outsiders never touch. That's fair, but the response to that argument was just as simple. Development can't be theoretical. You can't fully evaluate growth if you never fully commit to nurturing it. Quarterbacks don't develop in isolation. They develop through belief, clarity, and opportunity.
This is why everything keeps pointing back to Shedeur. Not because he was proven elite, not because failure was proven malicious, but because the process surrounding him now looks questionable in hindsight. And once the coaches most closely tied to that process were removed, the conversation shifted. What once looked like a verdict on a player began to look more like a verdict on how that player was evaluated. That's what makes this chapter of the story linger. If the competition wasn't truly equal, then the Browns' mistake wasn't choosing wrong. It was never giving one option the chance to fully show what it could become. And once that thought takes hold, it reframes everything that happened before and everything that comes next. When Shedeur Sanders finally stepped into real game action, the reaction wasn't relief, it was confusion. Not because he played perfect football, but because he looked far more composed than the circumstances suggested he should have been. That's the moment where the conversation shifted from talent to process, because quarterbacks don't suddenly find calm under pressure on Sundays if that calm hasn't been built during the week. In the NFL, performance is supposed to be the product of preparation. Reps with the starters create timing. Timing creates trust. Trust allows quarterbacks to play fast instead of thinking. According to reports and widespread observation, Shedeur didn't have that foundation. He entered games without the rhythm most young quarterbacks rely on. He didn't have the luxury of a system clearly molded around him, or a week-to-week plan built for his strengths. Yet when the moment arrived, he didn't unravel. He stood in the pocket, he took hits, he didn't rush reads or force throws out of panic. Late in games, with pressure mounting and mistakes already baked into the situation, he led drives that gave the Cleveland Browns a legitimate chance to win. Those moments mattered because poise isn't teachable in a hurry. It usually shows up when preparation meets opportunity. Here, it showed up despite the lack of it. That's where the frustration grew. Fans weren't arguing he was flawless, they were arguing the environment was. Watching him operate under constraints made people wonder what he might look like with real investment, with consistent first-team reps, with an offense shaped to his skill set, with coaches clearly aligned behind his development instead of split between past decisions and future potential. Critics pushed back, and not unfairly. They pointed out missed reads, they pointed out mechanical flaws, they reminded everyone that flashes don't equal franchise status, and that's all valid. But there was one part of that argument that kept falling apart under scrutiny. You can't evaluate improvement if you never truly invest in preparation. Studying tape isn't enough. Development requires trust. Trust that the offense is designed to help you succeed, not expose what you're still learning. Quarterbacks feel that difference immediately. When they know the system believes in them, they play freer. When they sense hesitation from play callers, that doubt sneaks into footwork, timing, and decision-making. That's why this chapter matters so much. Cleveland didn't just evaluate Shedeur's output, they evaluated it through a lens shaped by uncertainty and mixed signals. Now, with the coaching structure that controlled that lens removed, the organization appears to be questioning the lens itself. This isn't about rewriting history or assigning intent where none has been.
Proven. It's about recognizing that performance without preparation doesn't tell the full story. And in Shedeur's case, what many believe Cleveland saw wasn't his ceiling, it was his floor. That realization changes everything moving forward, because when preparation finally matches opportunity, excuses disappear, and so does the fog surrounding evaluation. What comes next isn't about what Shedeur survived, it's about what he becomes when survival is no longer the expectation. And that's where the story turns from frustrating to dangerous in the best possible way. Long before front office decisions became public, the most important judgment was already forming in a place cameras don't fully capture: the locker room. And according to reports, player reactions in how events unfolded afterward, that judgment wasn't split. It leaned quietly but firmly in one direction. In the NFL, players don't usually campaign against coaches. They don't air grievances openly. What they do instead is far more telling. They go quiet, they stop vouching, and they let their body language and energy speak for them. Throughout the season, there were subtle signs that trust between the offensive leadership tied to Tommy Rees in the locker room wasn't strong. Nothing explosive, no viral quotes, no public confrontations, just careful wording in interviews, a noticeable absence of vocal support, and a sense that belief wasn't fully there. In this league, silence doesn't mean neutrality, it often means detachment, and detachment is something decision-makers track closely. At the same time, the contrast on the other side of the ball couldn't have been clearer. The defense had an identity. Roles were defined. Communication felt clean. Most importantly, players knew exactly who they were playing for. That belief wasn't whispered. It showed up in effort, accountability, and eventually, public support for Jim Schwartz. When defensive leaders spoke, they didn't hedge, they didn't dance around answers, they expressed trust. That trust became impossible to ignore when Denzel Ward, one of the most respected voices in the locker room, openly endorsed Schwartz for a head coaching opportunity. That wasn't a throwaway comment. In NFL culture, players don't do that lightly. Public endorsements like that are signals. They tell ownership who commands respect. They reveal who players believe in when things are on the line. According to reports, Cleveland noticed. While Rees quietly faded out of the organization's future plans, Schwartz was brought back for deeper conversations, not just courtesy interviews, but discussions that suggested urgency. Rumors claim the Browns moved quickly to prevent other teams from pulling him away. That kind of urgency only exists when a franchise believes the locker room has already made its choice. This contrast changed how the entire coaching discussion was viewed. On one side, a coach associated with frustration, ambiguity, and a system players didn't seem fully connected to. On the other, a coach players openly trusted and rallied behind. This wasn't offense versus defense, it was clarity versus tension, belief versus doubt. To be fair, locker room dynamics are complex. Players don't see every meeting, coaches don't always get equal chances, and not every rumor reflects the full truth. But patterns matter, and when the same names surface in praise while others quietly disappear from conversation, organizations take note. The Browns weren't choosing a scheme, they were choosing who the players believed could lead them forward. Once that signal became clear, the rest of the offseason stopped feeling random. Because in the NFL, when the locker room speaks, even without raising its voice, the smartest organizations listen.
At some point, every owner faces the same decision: patch the problem or remove it entirely. For Jimmy Haslam, that moment didn't arrive with drama or public outrage. It arrived quietly, after patterns were impossible to ignore. And when the response finally came, it wasn't subtle, it was surgical. This wasn't about tweaking the staff. This was about severing an entire branch of how the organization had been operating. What made this reset feel different from the usual NFL turnover was its completeness. Letting a head coach go happens every year. It's expected. What raised eyebrows across the league was what followed. Instead of preserving familiar faces for continuity, Haslam went further. The people most closely tied to that era weren't shuffled around or reassigned. They were removed from the future entirely. No half measures, no transitional roles, just a clean cut. That's why Tommy Rees didn't survive the reset. According to reports, he wasn't simply passed over for a promotion. He was eliminated from the head coaching search and is unlikely to remain with the Cleveland Browns in any capacity. In ownership terms, that sends a clear message. Haslam wasn't interested in carrying over any part of the same decision-making chain. Keeping Rees would have meant preserving philosophy, loyalty, and internal dynamics that ownership now appeared determined to leave behind. From the outside, this move looks intentional, not emotional. Retaining Rees would have been the safer option. He knew the building, he knew the players, he represented continuity during uncertainty. But continuity only helps when the foundation is solid. Based on how the season unfolded, Haslam seems to have concluded the opposite. Whether that conclusion was fair or not, perception inside the building mattered more than optics outside it. There was also a message embedded in this reset, and it wasn't subtle to the people who needed to hear it. By clearing out the entire branch connected to the previous structure, ownership signaled that no one was protected by reputation, alignment, or past relationships. Not experience, not loyalty, not proximity to the former head coach. Accountability reset instantly, and players noticed that kind of decisiveness. It's important to be precise here. There has been no public statement saying this move was made specifically to protect or elevate Shedeur Sanders, but the timing makes interpretation unavoidable. The quarterback situation was one of the most criticized aspects of the season, and the coaches most closely tied to how that situation was handled are now gone. That doesn't prove intent, but in the NFL, actions often explain priorities better than statements ever could. Haslam could have taken the comfortable route, fire one coach, promote another, call it a reset, and move on. Instead, he chose disruption. And disruption usually means ownership believes the issue wasn't just results, it was culture, process, and trust. This wasn't panic, it was intent, a deliberate decision to create distance from the past rather than defend it. Once an owner commits to a reset this deep, the franchise doesn't drift anymore. It picks a direction. The gray areas disappear. And with the old structure gone, the spotlight moves exactly where it was always heading, onto the players who now get evaluated without inherited politics clouding the picture. With the old structure fully removed, the spotlight now lands squarely on Shedeur Sanders. And for the first time, there's no confusion about the environment surrounding him. The politics are gone. The mixed signals are gone. What remains is a clean runway. And in the NFL, that's rare. For months, Shedeur lived in a gray zone where public messaging and internal reality didn't always align.
That chapter is closed. The coaches who shaped that uncertainty are no longer guiding his future, and that alone changes everything. This reset benefits him in a way that goes beyond depth charts. A new staff means a fresh evaluation, no inherited loyalties, no attachment to earlier decisions, no pressure to defend how things were done before. If Cleveland brings in coaches who genuinely want to build around him, Shedeur finally gets alignment between philosophy, play design, and development. That kind of clarity accelerates growth faster than any offseason program ever could. But this opportunity cuts both ways. The same reset that clears doubt also erases excuses. If the Browns commit fully, with reps, protection, preparation, and a system designed for his strengths, the
the margin for error tightens. Shedeur won't be judged on flashes or what-ifs anymore. He'll be judged on consistency, command, and leadership. That's not unfair. That's the standard every franchise quarterback eventually meets. What makes this moment different is context. Few quarterbacks reach that stage after already surviving chaos. Shedeur has already shown he can function without ideal conditions. He's played without rhythm, without clear organizational backing, without an offense built specifically for him, and still he kept games competitive. That matters because it shifts expectations. The conversation moves away from whether he can endure pressure and toward whether he can control it. Survival is no longer the metric. Ownership is. Belief becomes the critical factor here. Quarterbacks feel it immediately when an organization believes in them. It changes how they process the field, how they command huddles, how they respond after mistakes. When belief is real, hesitation disappears. If Cleveland follows through on this reset, not just with words, but with action, Shedeur's confidence ceiling rises instantly. Not because of hype, but because structure breeds certainty. None of this guarantees success. Development isn't linear. New systems bring new challenges, and expectations will be higher than ever. But for the first time, Shedeur's path feels straightforward, instead of entangled in internal conflict. This reset isn't a promise, it's an opportunity, and opportunities at this level are unforgiving. You either take command of them, or they pass without waiting. That's what defines this moment. The narrative around Shedeur finally shifts from what was done to him to what he does with a clear chance in front of him. And that shift is the most important development of this entire offseason. When you step back and look at everything that unfolded, it becomes clear this was never just about one coach losing his job. What happened in Cleveland felt less like routine turnover and more like an unspoken admission. By cutting ties with Kevin Stefanski and completely removing Tommy Rees from the future, the Cleveland Browns quietly acknowledged that something fundamental wasn't working the way they claimed it was. For months, fans were asked to trust the process, trust the quarterback competition, trust the evaluations happening behind closed doors. But now the people most responsible for those evaluations are gone. And once that happens, it forces a difficult reassessment of everything that came before it. If the process was truly sound, why dismantle it so completely? If development was handled correctly, why erase the very structure that oversaw it? This is why the story keeps circling back to Shedeur Sanders, not because he was proven right or wrong, but because his situation exposes the cracks. If the competition was genuinely fair, there would be no need for such a decisive reset. If everything was based purely on merit, this offseason wouldn't feel so intentional. None of this proves sabotage. None of it confirms malice. These are interpretations shaped by timing, reporting, and outcomes. But in the NFL, actions almost always speak louder than explanations. To Cleveland's credit, the organization didn't choose the comfortable path. They didn't preserve familiar faces for stability or optics. They chose clarity over convenience. In a league where teams often delay admitting mistakes, that matters. This reset doesn't guarantee success. What it guarantees is honesty. From here on, evaluations happen without built-in excuses on either side. Now the picture is clear. If Shedeur thrives, it strengthens the argument that the environment was holding him back. If he struggles, the conversation shifts, but at least it does so on level ground. That's the difference. The Browns didn't just change coaches, they chose a direction. They stopped living in the gray space where messaging and reality don't align. So the real question isn't whether one coach deserved to be removed. The real question is whether Cleveland was finally willing to admit it got something wrong and brave enough to start over before the cost became irreversible. If this reset leads to real development, real belief, and real results, this offseason won't be remembered as chaos. It will be remembered as the moment Cleveland stopped protecting the past and finally committed to the future.